If a bunch of bees come together to form a hive and that hive is an animal, is the same true with humans? Do a bunch of humans come together and form a living creature? I ended up believing it does. We know enough about superorganisms that I could make falsifiable hypotheses. I could say the parts of a superorganism cannot live independent of the superorganism. Is that true with us? The parts of the superorganism enforce rigid conformity. Is that true with us? I mean, you can go through and make a list of these things. And as I did that and I looked at them, I became ever more convinced there is this creature, biological animal that lives and breathes and thinks. And I named it. I named it Agora.
Welcome to the Next Insights podcast, intersecting science, technology, and consciousness. I'm your host, Michael Morrissey, strategic futurist and founder of Next Collabs. This podcast explores the transformative potential of generative AI and its many applications for personal, professional, and business growth. Join us where we celebrate the next insights, those aha moments that shift your point of view and open the door into the next paradigm. You'll hear the latest ideas and thought-provoking conversations with industry experts, authors, thought leaders, equipping you with the strategies to harness the relentless pace of change in the AI era. Whether you're a CEO, leader, or interested in personal growth, this podcast will give you the insights to leverage AI to amplify human potential and consciously shape the future for humanity first. Let's dive into today's episode. Insights Podcast. I'm Michael Morrissey, your host, and today I'm excited to have author Byron Reese on the show. We met back in Q1 2022 when we hosted Byron and his book, The Fourth Age, for a month at our thought leadership community, Bookflow. And fast forward 2 years later, 100 episodes has occurred in the intervening 2 years of Bookflow. Q1 2024, we're hosting you again, Byron. So great to see you again. And your newest book, We Are Agora, How Humanity Functions as a Single Superorganism That Shapes Our World and Our Future. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Just as, let's say, frontispiece to this conversation, let me tell our audience a little bit about you. Byron Reese is a speaker, an author, an entrepreneur, and a futurist. As a speaker, he has the gift of storytelling. And Byron captivates audiences around the world with the good news story that technology is empowering us to build a better world. And he invites his listeners to imagine this better world and build it. As an author, Byron's books explore the intersection of technology, history, and humanity. I mean, Byron and Harari are like the perfect pair. I love both of them so much in terms of like explaining the arc of history in a very interesting way and how that intersection has defined our past and continues to influence our tomorrows. And he's also an entrepreneur. He walks the walk. He's an Austin-based, which is an entrepreneurial center in the world today, no question, with a quarter century of experience building and running technology companies with multiple IPOs and successful exits. Byron is a recognized authority on AI and holds 5 technology patents in disciplines as varied as crowdsourcing, content creation, and psychographics. The websites he has launched alone have received over 1 billion visits, and he has 3 billion YouTube views. And to pair with the book, highly recommend going to his new podcast, We Are Agora, where he's had luminaries, including probably one of his favorites, Kevin Kelly, on the show. Listened to it yesterday on a walk, Esther Dyson, and Doug Hoholen, our Director of Compliance and Governance at Next Collabs, and a big part of our community at the Next Collective. And as an extension of this latest book, really the way I sort of sense the podcast, Byron, it's like you're checking in with friends and colleagues to get their reflections on this thesis in the book on this concept of emergence. And in your conversation with Kelly, you talk about, the technium. I think Kelly's technium is in many ways very similar. You guys have kind of reached the same kind of thesis or conclusion about this moment. Maybe you can comment a little bit about what you've been up to for the last 2 years.
Well, as you indicated, I have a day job. I run a company. And so most of my days are doing that. I treat myself to writing between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m. every morning. And that's when I write my books. And I write books about topics I don't know very much about. They sound like a soundbite or something, but it's really true. I write about things that I'm interested in exploring, and I kind of document them. So my books, I think, read like you're hanging out with a friend at lunch and you're like talking about what's exciting in your life, because there are new things I'm figuring out and learning about. I mean, like the book I'm writing right now is about ghosts, and so it's something new and interesting to me. But this particular book, the Agora book, is my favorite, and it's special. I'd like to think it is a thesis that if I'm remembered for anything, it will be for this. What it tries to do is create the overview effect, which is that what happens to astronauts, when they go into space and see the whole world, they're like, oh, that's amazing. We're all one. I'm trying to create that without sending people into space. And that's what this book is.
Absolutely beautiful overview effect. And based on it, let's look at an overview of what a framework would look like as we navigate through this book. And I think this era, this kind of threshold that we're in right now. So I'm proposing something that I think resonates with you, because it's actually in the book in the final section. Past, present, future is the way you bring this book to a conclusion. It's a triad that I use all the time. I think we're both, as futurists, this is what we do. We look at the big arc and just kind of try to make sense in a Janus head-like way to look back and to also look forward to help us along this kind of path. So I'm looking at this kind of meta framework. And I think meta is a word that's very relevant when we're talking about emergence. You call it big history, 100,000 years. And you actually, I thought it was really, really intriguing. You call that the biography of Agora, which is really fascinating, and tell us more. And only 5,000 of that is recorded history. And then the second section of the framework is, we call it, let's say, near history, which is what just happened in the last 5 years. We went through the COVID moment and the AI moment. And I'm sure you agree, the AI moment is like a Renaissance moment. It's very, very big, that shift. And then finally, let's bring it to the conclusion and the book's conclusion on perhaps emergent history, the threshold into the AI emergent era of, and this concurs with Kelly, this concept of continuously becoming, that we are Agora, that we somehow are potentially having a waking up moment, that there's something bigger going on here where our technology possibly is coincidentally meeting us where we're at as a species to the next level of ourselves beyond our physicality, beyond space-time, that there's a superorganism. So why don't we start with your synopsis of part one of the book, Life and Big History.
So a superorganism, it's a biological thing. It's a creature, an animal that's made up of other animals. That may not sound like such a big deal, but it is really profound. I was introduced to the idea when I became a beekeeper. As a boy, I raised bees. And what I learned is that bees are made of cells just like we are, and they come together and form individual bees. But all the bees themselves form another animal, an actual living animal. This is biology. It's not metaphysics. That animal is warm-blooded, whereas bees are cold-blooded. The beehive, the group of bees, holds its temperature at 97 degrees. It has a memory, a long-term memory. It has a long lifespan. The hive might live 100 years, whereas a bee only lives a few weeks, and so forth. It isn't a metaphor to call it an animal. It is actually a creature. If it were all in skin, we would look at it and say, okay, I see it's an animal. Because it's not in skin, because it's distributed, it's harder for us to see it. But maybe you've heard of pheromones, and maybe you've heard of hormones. They're the same chemicals. Hormones are just things in your body, and pheromones are things outside of your body. And so when ants are laying down pheromones that other ants are reading, that's still one creature that is using hormones, basically, to communicate. So the book asks a very simple question. If a bunch of bees come together to form a hive, and that hive is an animal, is the same true with humans? Do a bunch of humans come together and form a living creature? I didn't know where I was going to land on that, and I ended up believing it does. I approached it. It's a scientific hypothesis. It's simply biology. That we know enough about superorganisms that I could make falsifiable hypotheses. I could say the parts of a superorganism cannot live independent of the superorganism. Is that true with us? The parts of the superorganism enforce rigid conformity. Is that true with us? I mean, you can go through and make a list of these things. And as I did that and I looked at them, I became ever more convinced there is this creature, biological animal, that lives and breathes and thinks. And I named it. I named it Agora. Now, it is comprised of people. People can be augmented or enhanced with technology, but you think about hunter-gatherers. They lived in a band of 100, and all those 100 people kind of knew how to do the same things. And the group couldn't really do anything more than any individual could do. Agora started to form in vague outline the minute those people specialized and together tackled things bigger than themselves. This is interestingly how single-cell life became multicellular as well. Started, everybody just all the cells kind of clumped together, then you get a little differentiation and more and more and more. But Agora really came to life in the city. So you can think of a city as a hive. It's not Agora, but it is sort of that place that all those interactions happen. Now, probably the best way to think about it, I think, is think about yourself, because you're actually a superorganism. You're made of cells, and those cells are interesting because they're alive. Like, by any definition, cells are alive, but they are not made of anything that's living. They're made of non-living matter. So that is the primary unit of life on planet Earth. All life is made up of cells. Now, here's the fascinating thing. If I took you apart a cell at a time, and I put those cells in petri dishes, they would live on, but you would vanish. And so the question becomes, what were you? You're not a cell. You're a pattern that has these emergent properties. And like that, a bunch of people come together and form. I liken it in the book to one of those posters maybe you've seen, and it's like a poster of a puppy. And when you squint and look really closely at it, you see that it is made up of little photographs of other puppies. And so what you have is the same physical matter, the same spot, the same ink, but you've got two different levels of order. And by the way, there's no philosophical reason it can't keep going up that a bunch of Agoras come together and form something else and something else, something else. I don't think it happens because of the age of the universe. It just wouldn't. It hasn't been around long enough, but there's nothing philosophical about it.
Well, I was going to say, is the concept of the superorganism and Agora something that happens at a certain stage in evolutionary history of that 100,000 years? Or is there an inflection point where you go, there's a waking up moment? And it is? Or has it always been there? It's just that we're now kind of waking up to this reality.
That's a fantastic question. I would think of it a lot like multicellular life. Why are, a tadpole is multicellular, and we are, but we're a much more complex and much more powerful and much more differentiated thing than, say, the tadpole is. So ultimately, you want to know if Agora is conscious. And if Agora thinks, and the answer to that question is going to fundamentally be, does consciousness arise out of complexity? Which maybe it does and maybe it doesn't. If it does, then Agora is vastly more complex than us and it is conscious. If consciousness comes from some other thing, which it could, then we don't know. You can spot the superorganism, by the way, because you actually see new capabilities that none of the individuals have. For instance, maybe you've heard like how bees can find a new home. There are all these criteria. They're really complicated, and they had this really elaborate process where the bees scout, and then they vote, and then they lay down trail. I mean, this complexity that humbles you when you realize no bee has ever done it before. Those bees are only 2 or 3 weeks old. Their brains are half the size of a grain of salt. So no bee knows what it's doing, but the hive does that. And so the corollary to us would be, I kind of was introduced to this idea with an essay called I Pencil by a man named Leonard Reed in the 50s, where he says there's not a human alive who can make a pencil. There's nobody who can mine the ore and make the steel and bend the ferrule and make the yellow paint, and yet pencils get made. Likewise, in our day and age, your body is made of 30 elements. A smartphone is made of 60 elements, and nobody can make that. But so how does it get made? Well, Agora makes it. Agora knows how to make that smartphone, whereas we're like that bee with a half a grain of salt. And really, you can see it clearly if you look at a city. And I like to think about Manhattan because it's so kind of nicely and neatly self-contained. Your body has about 240 different kinds of cells, and those cells each has its own algorithm. It has its own thing it does, and it just does its thing. It just lives its life oblivious to you. The U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics tracks 10,000 different jobs, and that is the equivalent. There are 10,000 different kinds of cells in Manhattan. And you see, if two bricklayers come together who don't know each other, they can, with a little information exchange, they can work together because they're both doing this kind of bricklaying algorithm. I mean, we criminalize deviations from the accepted norm. If you're a brain surgeon and you're like, I'm going to do this operation my own way, I mean, that's criminal negligence. You have to obey your algorithms and you have to do it. And because those 10,000 different jobs are doing their thing, the city comes to life. So 40,000 tons of food are trucked into Manhattan every day. 10,000 tons, I'm sorry, to provide supplies for 40,000 restaurants and all the grocery stores. And somehow the right amount of flour comes in for the bagels and the pizzas, even though there's all these variables. And it's why? Well, it isn't somebody in charge of ordering for it. It's all of those pizza owners running their algorithms, and they do their thing. And just like your platelets don't know you exist, and when you cut your finger, they're not, oh, let's go clot Michael's cut. They are just doing their thing. And that's what happens. And so when we are all doing our thing, we get these emergent properties. Now, you may say, well, why do you have to go that extra step and say that's a living creature? Because it does exhibit all of these elements. It is no different than the relationship of you to your cells. I could take that city apart a person at a time, and all those people would live and thrive, but the city will have vanished. And it takes on these new emergent capabilities. It can do these things that no person can do. And it has a different lifespan. The city lives for centuries, but no person does. And that city has a memory. And by the way, that city learns as people interact with it. They shape it by their mere interaction with it, and it learns and remembers things in a completely demonstrable way. And so at some point, the burden kind of shifts, and you say, if you believe you're alive, if you believe you're a creature, you still have to wrestle with, well, what are you? Because the only living things are cells, and you're not a cell. So what are you? Well, you're a pattern. And then there's no reason you're the be-all, end-all, that a bunch of people don't come together and form that same thing.
A couple thoughts come to my mind. This idea in personal development, the idea of really surface your unique ability, your unique self. And when you think about that relative to the way you're describing this, the more you become singular, and we could talk about specialization as a key component of this, which heretofore I always thought specialization, we needed to get past that and get onto a more I contain multitudes kind of, I could do more than just one thing and be a cog. But actually specialization turns out to be a real superpower when we're thinking about each individual cell getting very, very, very specific. Because what that does paradoxically, it adds to the kind of like the overarching power of the network effect of the emergent superorganism. Talk about that sort of paradox. It's very fascinating.
It appears we're not as intelligent as we used to be. Individually, we're not. Our brains have shrunk over the last 3,000 years, and there's good reason to believe we are individually regressing. Yet collectively, we know more. Each of us knows a narrow slice of a larger thing. So you talk about extraordinariness or being different and all of that. Yes and no. At first, I thought that ultimately I was going to disprove Agora because I would say, well, people are way too different. We're all so different that we can't be these kind of 240 different kinds of cells in the body. But turns out not to be the case. I mean, when you take a big step back and you say, okay, I've never met anybody who has half a mustache, ever. Not a single person. They always seem to grow both sides. If you decided to start signing all your emails at work with in accordance with the prophecy, or you decide you're going to wear a cape to work and a monocle, you're not getting the big promotion. We manufacture workers in a school system where we give them standardized tests, and you're graded on your ability to do the standardized thing. And, when you join the Army, they don't give you 4 different uniforms. You get to pick one out on your whim. They give you one, and then they shave your head so you look like everybody else. Time after time after all of these areas, we enforce rigid conformity on everybody. We allow these little narrow areas. Now, there are differentiated roles in a beehive. Like there's a queen bee. I mean, she's not in charge of anything, but she is singularly important to that hive. She is the reproductive unit. And so there are people, obviously, who do extraordinary, wonderful things for Agora, but we can't escape that we are fundamentally cells in an organism, and we cannot live apart from that organism anymore. I try to go through it very carefully in the book to say, out of 100 people that you drop individually on the desert island, how many of them could survive, let alone thrive, by the way. But we shouldn't be embarrassed by this, because what has happened is we have thrown our lot in with each other. I can know less because I am part of a group, and the group collectively knows more. And so I think it's a wonderful thing that we are like that.
The concept of Agora is something that's strongly presented in my history, like at 19, going to Greece and actually seeing the Agora. And as an architect and an urban designer and city builder, master planner type of person, I would suggest that the Agora was Western civilization's first real statement of the public space or the public realm or a public good.
Agreed.
And how does that relate to this idea of this kind of like the superorganism, which is, it's not one of us, it's the sum is greater than the parts, and then it's the kind of manifestation of something even greater, like the exponential effect of all of that together creates something that we don't know. And is that somehow not a thing, but it's more like a space? It's like a public space.
Yes. So the Agora was a place in ancient Greece, which was, as you're saying, the town center. And all the activity happened there, all the commerce, all the debating, political stuff, all the, there were people out there yelling. There were cultures, all different people. So it was this place, and it was where people interacted. And it's that interaction.
High intersectionality, right?
I put in the book, I talk about like the first time a bunch of people, no person could take down a mammoth. But when they came together, 10 people, and they said, okay, you do this, and you're really good at this, and you're strong, and you're fast. All right, let's do that. That would be, like I said, the very beginning of it. It's the ability to do something more than you had been able to do before. It is why no gear can tell time, but gears assembled cunningly together can tell time. And that's what we are, just to a much more complex degree.
I love that analogy of the clock that you bring up in the book, that the parts on their own can't tell time, but there's something about the way it's put together compositionally as a sum of the parts that creates some effect that is entirely new and unexpected, which is a meta effect called it measures time.
Right. I'm fascinated by emergence. So emergence, the definition is when a system takes on attributes that none of its parts have. And what's interesting is how it happens. How does that form? And because it has to kind of self-form from the bottom up. I write about in the book these amazing abilities that certain insects have. And like there's termites eat non-load-bearing wood before they eat load-bearing wood. So they don't know what load-bearing wood is or non-load-bearing wood, right? And yet somehow the termite mound has intelligence to not fell the tree on itself. And so you say, how does that come about? How does it get that extra level of smarts? And the whole middle section of the book is about that. It's me mulling on that and trying to figure out how does that happen. You have to have a way to encode information. You have to have a way that accesses it. You have to have energy to propel it. And you can kind of almost work it out and see how it happens. How is it that people can build a smartphone, but no person can build a smartphone? And by the way, there is a reason this book purports to answer the fundamental question of human existence, which is why are we here? Now, I purport to answer that scientifically, which is a bold claim because science does not like why questions. Science likes how questions. How does this work? And how did that happen? Why tries to change the subject real quickly. I think I can tell you why we are here. I mean, and that's the takeaway. It's wrapped up in the conundrum of why there's just one intelligent species on this planet. When you know the answer to that, I think it all makes sense.
This podcast, the Next Insights podcast, is all about like that aha moment when you just like, in this book, you talk about this idea, the sum is greater than the parts. The whole is entirely new and often unexpected. The moment I read that in the book, that was just one of those moments where I can't go back. You just opened the aperture of an Aristotelian statement that I myself used all the time about master planning a city, because let's not just think about one building. Let's think about the whole master plan and let's get that right. And then one building is part of the whole, but we're trying to make something greater than the sum of the parts. And then in the process, I think when we're master planning, we're starting to kind of, let's say, dance with emergence. And that's where you start to include the public realm. It's not the objects, it's the spaces.
Absolutely. I'm with you entirely. At the very beginning of this, you talked about this moment we're in, and you talked about the AI moment and the significance of it. May I speak to that real quickly?
Yeah, please do.
I'll tell you my aha moment about that.
Yeah, and I wanted to know also, I was going to ask you this question. Like everyone has a moment where they opened up ChatGPT and they just said, okay, let's go. I'd love to ask you, like, what was your moment with opening the box?
I was convinced it was rigged because I gave it all of my standard questions, which are very well publicized. People know them. And I have a long experience of people hard coding the answers into these things. But when you deviate from them a little bit, they break. And I was like, oh, they just read my books. And then I started asking all these different questions. And I was like, no, it's that good. And, exponential curves, even if you intellectually know, even though you cannot internalize it, because nothing in the physical world behaves that way. But let me tell you my big aha moment. So this story begins with the Big Bang. There was a star that lived 5 billion years and blew up, that coalesced and lived 5 billion years and blew up. And then our star came along. Ours is a third generation one. And very quickly you had the Earth, and it began to cool. So we're 4 billion years ago, and almost immediately life appeared. And that's a huge mystery, why it appeared so quickly and why it only appeared once. And the reason we know that, or that it only persisted once, is that all life on planet Earth is related. You can take a gene from a banana and put it in a person, and you can smell like a banana, whatever. Now, here's what blew my mind. That life is all based on DNA, and DNA isn't alive. It is just data. It's data storage. That's all it is. It's 4 characters, and it's about 600 megabytes of data, 2.5 billion base pairs. 600 megabytes of data. That's all it is. It's just data. Now, that lasted for 3.5 billion years, and that was the only place information could be stored on planet Earth. And it took 100,000 years to edit it, to write something new, because it had to chance mutate and then endure and all that. Now, this speeds up very quickly. Don't worry. 500 million years ago, the Cambrian comes around, and we evolve this second place to store information called brains. And it doesn't take that much time to write to them, because there's a process called learning, and you can learn something and store all of this. And so that took us to a whole different level, because there's now 2 places to write information. Then humans developed speech, and then very recently, we found a third place to store information, and that is externally with writing. And man, the minute that happened, the human genome collectively wasn't our DNA or even our DNA plus our brains. It was everything that had been written down. Now, that propelled us, hockey sticked us up, starting with the Bronze Age and all of that. But it was real expensive, so we didn't save hardly anything. Then Gutenberg comes along, and he's like, okay, I can do it for almost free. And the amount of data stored, the amount of information stored exploded. And that gave us a scientific revolution. That gave us modernity. And that hockey sticked it up even further. Now, that hit a brick wall. Why? Because you would take all those books and you would put them in libraries. And libraries are like that last scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where they're putting the Ark in that warehouse. Libraries are almost places where ideas go to die, because they get buried in there and you can't find them. So that was oh my gosh, what am I going to do? Now, what we did is we digitized all that, and we invented Google. And so now you could search it. But here's the big idea. It may have taken humans 100,000 years to evolve an aversion to a purple berry. When I tell you don't eat the purple berry, you just evolved 100,000 years in 2 seconds. So our evolution now is millions of years a second, because every time you tell somebody something that they didn't have to evolve, it is as if that is a demutation. Now, the big problem with Google is when you say, what is the difference between a cold and the flu? Google's like, I got 30 million answers for you. Here's the first one. Here's the second one. 30 million of them. What happens is all human knowledge is still siloed in 50 billion web pages, and there's no attempt to bring it together. Google will merely search it all. What LLMs are, the big thing is they are the 4th place to write information. They are attempting to consolidate all human knowledge into one database, where you ask, what's the difference between a cold and the flu? And it says, here's the answer. And that is something humanity has never had, a central memory, a central storehouse. So if brains gave us the Cambrian, and then writing gave us the Bronze Age, and then Gutenberg gave us scientific, and then the digital age, the idea that we are building a memory, collective memory for this planet, and then it's all coming together in these LLMs, I think that is profound and will dwarf everything. I mean, it will be bigger than we can imagine. So that's my aha moment of understanding that LLMs aren't just a better search engine or something. They are a synthesis of information instead of 50 billion silos of it.
I had a similar, aha moment when I started working with ChatGPT back in November 2024. It was November 30th or December 1st, somewhere in there. that it was like I was accessing the vast repository of, everything ever imaged, outpictured by mankind or written by mankind. And so effectively, it is like the unconscious. Now, how is that any different than Agora? Is that Agora? Are we getting just access to Agora?
No, not the way I see things. So Agora is a biological creature. It's an animal that its cells are people. Now, if its cells were people and we didn't have speech, we wouldn't really be able to coordinate our activities all that well. Therefore, you don't ever get this emergent thing. It's why a pod of dolphins doesn't do something more than a dolphin does. Or you could get 100 beavers and they're not going to make a better dam than one beaver would make, and they'll just make a bigger one. We get the emergent layer that none of those creatures get because we have these tools for emergence. It's speech or communication, from learning, and all these other things that come together and do it. So what happens is that the Technium or ChatGPT or whatever it is a force multiplier of Agora, just like we could do more with writing all of a sudden. But it isn't alive. We are, I think. And Agora is alive.
So it has a physicality, right? It's
Does the beehive have a physicality?
Maybe it's a simultaneity, right? It's a simultaneity. Again, it's an emergence. It is, okay, so it's like a yes and, or it is beyond the opposites. I think that's maybe where we're playing here, right? Emergence is when you transcend the opposite. There's a third thing. Jung would call it a transcendent function, kind of 1 + 1 = 3. And that's probably also how we could sort of circumscribe this. You talk about weak and strong emergence. I think that was a nice differentiation. Maybe just give us...
Yeah, so not my distinction, and it's hotly debated. Weak emergence is something everybody agrees is, and it's where a new capability comes about that wasn't there before, and it's a surprise. But you can study it and figure it out. You can study that clock and say, I see what they're doing here. Pretty clever. So we call it a weak emergent phenomenon. Now, there's a theorized strong emergence that some people believe exists and some people believe is magical thinking. And what it says is that you cannot study it and you're not smart enough. It is impossible to study it and see how it came about. And often the example is consciousness. It could say you could study consciousness for all eternity, and there's no way to understand how the experience of something emerges from inorganic matter. You just can't. It is not derivable from the interactions. Some people think strong emergence is just weak emergence. We haven't figured it out. We haven't had that. I see what they're doing. Some people say, no, it's a fundamental force of the universe where things can take on these higher levels, but you can't dissect it. And it would be like, how do you take apart a cell and find out where the life is? Right? Like it's a nonsensical way of thinking. And they would say that about strong emergent phenomenon. You cannot dissect consciousness and figure out where it comes from. Space and time, by the way, could very well be strong emergent phenomenon.
Hello, book enthusiasts, knowledge seekers, and lifelong learners. If you're passionate about diving deep into the realms of technology, science, and consciousness, then consider joining us in our BookFlow membership. In our unique community, we don't just read books, we immerse ourselves in them. Every week, we come together to dissect and absorb the groundbreaking ideas and content that shapes our world. And the best part, we often have authors themselves join us for riveting discussions. Previous guest authors include Gary Bowles, Scott Barry Kaufman, Stephen Kotler, Salim Ismail, Charlene Lee, Byron Reese, Franz Johansson, and many others. Join us for thought-provoking conversations with members from diverse backgrounds, each bringing their unique perspective to enrich our discussions. Visit our website in the show notes and sign up today and use the promo code to get 50% off your first month. Don't miss out on this opportunity. I look forward to seeing you in our Autotelic community. Here's a question for you. Obviously, I'm a Canadian, so hockey stick is the way I describe the expo moment, right, that we're in. Kelly talks about the idea of that we're going through a phase transition in Inevitable 2016. That's one of my favorite books. I'm sure that's one of yours as well.
He's great.
Oh, my God. He, as a futurist, the way he describes it, I baked it in.
What a good guy. Like even that he'll come on my show, like he'll give me the time of day
Yeah.
and he will come on at my invitation and have a conversation with me and just make himself that available. I think it's just wonderful.
Yeah, that was a wonderful podcast. Highly recommend it to everyone. Take it in. Go for a walk, 30 minutes, and you just get a like direct into what's Kelly up to? What's he been up to? Just this concept of phase transition, right? Where a liquid becomes a solid and you can't go back. And so, and I think what makes this era this moment, the AM moment and this expo moment very different is that it's almost like past, present, future kind of collapse and it's all happening. Like before and after is happening in real time. That threshold is very apparent. Back in the Renaissance, we'd look at that and you'd go, in 19th century, they named it the Renaissance, post-rationally, as historians said. Oh, that was the Renaissance, by the way. That was a big inflection point. Here we are today, but we actually know it's happening. This is part of Kelly's thesis, right? Fixities to flows. That we're becoming flows. We're becoming wikis. We're continuously becoming. And I'm wondering, is this concept of emergence, is that the exponential kind of curve? Is that what we're starting to kind of wake up to? How do we adapt to something that is continuously occurring as opposed to, linearly occurring? And that maybe it's very disruptive, but when we transcend our kind of like former selves, we realize that we are that emergence. Is that what's happening here?
I think so. I think it's wrapped up in what I was saying earlier about it would take you 100,000 years to evolve an aversion to that berry. And when I say here, I have a berry. Now, how long would it take you to evolve the ability to make an iPhone? We did. The species did somehow. We evolved the ability to make an iPhone. How long, if it was just Michael on a planet, how long would it take for you to evolve that ability? It would take you infinity, trillions upon trillions, unnameable years to be able to mine the cobalt and to learn it all. You don't get to stuff up in books. You have to just like you eventually evolved an aversion to that purple berry, you would have to eventually evolve the ability to make an iPhone. And yet here we have this iPhone. So what has happened is as our access to information has gone up so much, we are now evolving trillions of years a minute is kind of the way to think about what the species is able to do. The thing about it here, Moore's law, right? Like computers double every 2 years, double in power. When you stop and think about that, it took us 100,000 years of humanity to make your laptop. Now, in 2 years, we're going to duplicate what we did in that 100,000 years in just 2 years. And then guess what? In 2 more years, we're going to duplicate all of that. When you have to put it in that thing to realize that all of human history made your laptop, but it's only going to take 2 years to make it twice as good. That gives you this sense of why it all feels different suddenly. Because when you have as much technology as we have and you double it, and then you double it, and then you double it, every one of those doublings is everything that came before it. You just doubled it all. Because, what Moore didn't know, what Kurzweil figured out, is that it isn't just computers that do that. It's all technology seems to do that. Even multicellular life appears to double in complexity every 176 million years. We don't know why, by the way, but technology seems to double. And so when you take everything the world has and double it, it's like, oh man, that's a lot of stuff.
We would be remiss, and you mentioned Manhattan. I think we should take a little deeper dive. That's probably my favorite city on the planet.
You're famous for your architectural tours of it. Well, why don't you wax about Manhattan for a moment? Tell me why it's so profound to you.
Yeah, and this, I guess, was my question that was coming up in my mind. Is there a kind of like a categorization of superorganisms? Like Manhattan is a superorganism in the sense the next level. Are there some that are minor and there's some that are like, there's something very special happening here. Mm-hmm. There is a magic sauce that goes on in Manhattan that is it's got a can-do attitude. It's a city that never sleeps. It almost celebrates the fact that it is a superorganism, that it's playing with kind of like some sort of power that transcends. You can't do that. Every other city, you can't do that. But in Manhattan, we're going to build land in a place where it's scarce over top of a rail yard and call it Hudson Yards. And it's going to be a new city center, mixed use center in the heart of the city. And they said, this is going to get done. And it's going to get done. And it's going to get done on the next level up. So are there some superorganisms that are just, there's something very special going on that this makes this a center on the planet.
There are actually, and there's a corollary to this in the natural world. It's called unicolonality. So you might go and see an ant mound someplace, and then you come back in a month, and 50 yards away, there's another one, and two more over here. And then you come back, and there's more, and there's more, and there's more. And they go on. Until they hit the water, there's no stopping them. They have I call it a manifest destiny, like a manifest destiny in the ball. Now, every one of those ant colonies is its own superorganism. It can reproduce on its own. It has emergent abilities on its own. Like it could live on its own in isolation, all the other ant colonies. So they're all individual superorganisms. Now, a very interesting thing about ants is if you take an ant from one of those colonies and go 2 colonies over and drop it in, normally they would tear it apart, but they don't. They recognize it as a fellow ant. They just put it to work. Get to work. So there's 1 billion people that change cities every year. And that's moving an ant from one to the other. But the city is the unit. It isn't countries, because a city is the only thing that is defined by the fact that it is people interacting. A state isn't, a country isn't, a county isn't. If you took all the people out of Nevada, Nevada still exists. If you take all the people out of Reno, there is no Reno anymore. So the city is the functional unit because it is defined by the fact that there are people there. Cities, by the way, grow old and die. They have historically. And just like bees sometimes can find an old hive to move into, so like already got comb and stuff, occasionally we find places where there were cities before and we build cities there. And the very oldest cities, by the way, when you look at them, they're not differentiated. They're a bunch of round houses that look just like single-cell organisms starting to clump together. And then only after time do you get differentiation, just like with people, just like with cities, where the city itself has the division of labor within it and high degrees of specialization around it. So I think Manhattan is a living creature.
It's like a power center. In a sense, there's something going on here. Now the physicality of Manhattan is profound, and the outpicturing of it, the skyscrapers, the kind of, you were talking about the overview effect, that's sort of the reaching for and celebration of itself. Like it has an ego, right? I always categorize or describe the streets as almost like runways, Everyone looks good. Everyone's like just got a bit of an edge. They're showing off. There's a self-expression going on there that you don't find in most cities. It's like it's aware of itself. I think that's true. I think there's something there. They get to play with the emergence. And now here's a question for you. What about Silicon Valley? Is that a superorganism? It doesn't have the same form.
Now, keep in mind, we don't have to be rigid. You can believe in the Gaia hypothesis that all life is alive, and the technium, Kevin Kelly's idea that all technology comes together and forms superorganisms, and you can believe that New York is one. All we're talking about are different levels of order, and where you have different level of order with differentiation, then you get emergent capabilities, then you have something new, and it's that something new that is the superorganism. So they can be multiple, they can be nested on top of each other. We think very, cups make a pint, 2 pints make a quart. But it is not like that. We're talking about different levels of order. So it is. The reason no 2 cities are identical, nor would they be, is because the city builds itself up organically. It grows from an embryo, as it were, and it expands out and becomes its thing. It adapts to the space that it's in and the people interacting, mold and shape it, and it's birthed and grows old and maybe dies.
Here's one. Let's dial this over to the corporation. Is Apple a superorganism?
Well, what we would say is, can Apple employees live outside of Apple? Probably they can. So they are not so specialized that they can no longer live apart from that organism. It's questionable about people because a lot of people can't move to, say, another country where they don't have the language, where they are not able to function in it. So no, I don't think so. But again, is there rigid conformity that's enforced? Absolutely. I go through and develop the science. I try to develop the science, a generalized way of thinking about superorganisms. And I list all the attributes of them. And I would just encourage people to run through that list when you're thinking of an entity. The question is it conscious? We don't know. But humanity as a whole became a superorganism. When you look at the amount of communication that happens now electronically by the second, and all the stuff that goes on, and all the people that move, and all the phone conversations, and all the email exchanges, this is all neurons firing in a giant brain. So I'm convinced all of humanity didn't used to be. Like, we read about times like when, maybe China was integrated with the rest of the world, 500 years ago or something, where you didn't have common cultural touch points. You didn't have, you get Marco Polo come through every now and then, but that's about it. So those would have been isolated. But now humanity is so integrated that you can think of all of humanity, except a few uncontacted tribes that still exist, that if you mentioned Santa Claus or Elvis Presley, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. Everybody else is now part of this one, I think, creature.
Do you think that's part of the solution, the watchtower, the blue dot kind of phenomenon, where we need the capacity to zoom out so that we can realize that we are not simply a bunch of individuals with what appears to be an increasingly greater amount of opposition, but then when we zoom out with this watchtower effect or overview effect, that we are one, and that we are, in Siegel's, phrase, we, MWE, that we need to be reminded that we're humanity. And I think this concept is more important than ever, especially as we pass through into the AI kind of emergent era, the way I describe it, where the opportunities are just unfathomable. What, as Kevin Kelly says, just add AI to every company or everything. And that we're going through that threshold right now. And on the other side is the existential threat is actually real, and that we need to wake up to that bigger sort of overview effect of we are humanity. That's the project, is to steer, shape humanity's future, not the tech's future. This is about humanity. What are your thoughts around that?
Look, the left hand doesn't have to like the right hand, but it needs to understand if the left and right hand are part of the same creature, they're going to live and die in lockstep. There's no way for the left hand to win and the right hand to lose if we're all part of the same animal. So I'm not trying to appeal to people's higher kumbaya kind of sentiment, other than to point out a simple fact that, humanity as a unit lives and dies like an animal, as a single creature. And there are no examples of superorganisms where half of the bees are against the other half, that is not a functional unit. There isn't one like that. That would be despotic. I mean, that would be chaotic. It would just be terrible. And so I tried to just drop that analogy.
And as you bring this to a close in the book, you bring in sort of empathy, love, connection, collaboration, cooperation and Harari talks about this too in his series, that's one of our greatest superpowers, is that we kind of coordinate and collaborate. And that has been part of the arc of our evolution. And I guess we could bring this to a conclusion by answering this question. Why are we here?
Well, to what you just said about the empathy piece, I think there's a lot of people in the world who don't know that they're doing the quote right thing with their life, or they should be doing more, or whatever. They carry that weight around. And I think what Agora teaches me is that you should move past that nobody can contemplate it. It can do about anything, but you can't steer it. It's not going to live or die based on you or me. It will live or die based on all of us doing our thing, just doing your thing. And so put no heavier burden on yourself than to try to be a little kinder to people, and every day just try to be a little bit better. And that is all it takes to build utopia. Now, why are we here? I think I know. There's a Gaia hypothesis, which is that James Lovelock said all living things on the earth together form a superorganism that holds the earth in a range that is conducive to life. Because he points out there's all these things like the salinity of the oceans is held constant for hundreds of millions of years. Why would that be? Rivers are washing salt in every day, and then the water's evaporating. Why don't they get saltier and saltier? Well, there's a convection of the crust, and it holds it constant. And the amount of oxygen in the air held constant. All these things are held constant. Anyway, all these things. He was always unclear whether he thought it was alive or acted like a living system. I'm going to use the language of it being alive, but it doesn't have to be. Let's just say it could also just be a system. That system would still have wants, the way you would say my sports car wants to burn premium gasoline. If the earth behaves like a living system, what would it want? Well, it would want what all living things want. It would want to live, to survive, and to reproduce. The first one. Should it worry about dying? Absolutely. it is going to get whacked by a rock, a great big space rock that is going to reset it. That it can't do anything about. So it should definitely worry about that. So what should it do? It comes back to that question about why just one intelligent species on this planet. I think it's because intelligence is incredibly self-destructive. One very reasonable explanation of the Fermi paradox is that why we don't see aliens everywhere is that they get to a certain point and they blow themselves up. And 99.99999% of all life that's ever lived isn't intelligent. It does just fine. So I think we're really volatile. Now, if you are a Gaia and you evolve 20 intelligent species, well, one of them ends up blowing everything up. But if you don't evolve any, you get hit by a rock and you get reset. That there's this Goldilocks number of 1. You evolve one intelligent species. That's still very risky. They could still blow themselves up, but they are your only hope for deflecting that asteroid and you surviving. And what would happen if that were the case? It's just evolution. Imagine the Gaia as a system or a creature. Let's say there are 3 different kinds. There's one that evolves tons of intelligent life. Well, they go extinct. And there's ones that never evolve intelligent life. Well, they get hit by rocks. But there's this one that can usually evolves 1 and they live on. And the answer to the riddle of why life began here so quickly is because it didn't begin here. I think, all through those billions of years prior, all those rocks hitting those things throw up all that biological matter and it drifts through space and it landed here fully formed and just took off. And then lo and behold, we were part of that strain. That's how it reproduces. Just like flowers send out pollen in the wind. That's how life reproduces. That's how Gaia reproduces. And we are just part of that strain that happens to produce one intelligent species. Now, my falsifiable statement is, if I am right, we are going to find alien life, but it will have GTCA double helix DNA. You could take genes from it and put them in us. Because I think there's one kind of life that floats around planet to planet, landing and growing, and billions of years pass and so forth. So we are here to protect this planet. That is why we are here. And to the extent that we do that, this planet lives and spreads.
2 things that come to mind. That sounds like your next book.
No. Yeah.
And then the second one, that just to bring this to a conclusion, is I think the way that you concluded the book was that, and there's something about the word Agora. It just has a resonance about it. It feels like a space. It's like 1 + 1 = a third space, something that is bigger than the sum of the parts that you didn't expect, that emerged from this, called humanity. And it's home. And that's sort of like from the heart. There's something about that. It's a touch point that we're part of that. And that's very, very, it's a beautiful thing. So I really appreciate the metaphor and add it to my own lexicon and my own sort of sensibility about.
Well, thank you.
Why we're here.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And I want you to show me around Manhattan.
Oh, geez, definitely. Okay. We could do that summer. So yeah, let's do that. And I'm looking forward to tomorrow night's session. You're actually going to give us a slideshow relative to We Are Agora, which I'm really excited about. And where can we find you? LinkedIn or?
And luckily I've been around long enough that I'm Byron Reese on everything. Even my email address is Byron Reese @gmail. Like, I'm the easiest guy in the world to find. Thank you for taking the time to chat with me. I know it's a lot of words, and I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Byron. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Next Insights podcast. If you enjoy this episode, take a screenshot and share it with a friend. And if you really love the podcast, head over to wherever you're listening and leave a rating or a review. This helps our show get in front of more people interested in shaping the future of science, technology, and consciousness. Finally, to receive even more insights on what we're discussing, thinking, and reading at Nexco Labs, sign up for our weekly newsletter by clicking the link in the show notes. I'll talk to you next week, but until then, consciously embrace disruption, my friends.